My great-grandparents told me stories of a mighty dragon that descended on the holy temple. The people had rebelled against God. I will declare my judgments against them for all their evil in forsaking me. They have made offerings to other gods and worshipped the work of their own hands. In his anger, God turned his people over to the fearsome enemy, King Nebuchadnezzar, the dragon of Babylon, through whom the fury of God burned against my people. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has devoured me. He has crushed me. He has made me an empty vessel. He has swallowed me up like a dragon. The tears of my people flowed like a river, but they could not quench the fires that consumed our land. Into the wilderness we were led, defeated and destroyed. The God we'd forsaken, we thought he'd forsaken us. But even in our darkest moment, God would not leave or forsake his people. Once more, he made us a promise. I will not look on you in anger, for I am merciful. I will not be angry forever. Only acknowledge your guilt that you rebelled against the Lord your God. I will take you, one from a city and two from a family, and I will bring you to Zion. For 70 years, the people of God lived in Babylon. Over time, Babylon began to wither, and a great lion rose from the east, Cyrus, the king of Persia. His armies consumed the world. He set his gaze on the remains of the great dragon's lair, Babylon. There, Cyrus led a cunning attack, and the kingdom fell. Cyrus was a great and good king and did not believe in keeping men as slaves. During the first year of his reign, he issued a decree that freed the Jews. God stirred the hearts of his most devoted people to journey back to Jerusalem and rebuild his temple. And let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods, with beasts, besides free will offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Cyrus went the way of all men. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Behold, Ahasuerus, Xerxes the Great. Under Xerxes, the empire prospered, and so did the Jews, who did not return to Jerusalem. Among these Jews was a family of the tribe of Benjamin. They gathered all they could scrape together and headed out from Babylon for the richest city the world had ever known, the Persian capital of Susa. During the journey, both the mother and father died, leaving a baby girl to Mordecai. Little did my cousin know that I would grow to be a woman the world would never forget.
So there is a up to the minute, or should I say, bringing you up to speed ahead of the book of Esther. And tonight we'll be in the book of Esther, looking at Esther, how she stood in the gap. But before we go there, the last several weeks, this is week 3 in our series, the last several weeks we've done something new at the beginning, really offering ourselves collectively to the Lord to ask Him to speak to us. And so follow along with me. We're going to read this together as it comes up on the screen. All right? Your word is written in my mind. Your word is hidden in my heart. Your word is true and eternal. Your word is a light to my feet and to my path. Speak to me today, God, and my obedience will be with my life. Amen? Amen. Amen. So tonight we are in week 3 of our series, In the Gap. And if you remember, in the first week we discussed that the gap is a place of vulnerability. A gap is a dangerous place. Historically, as you think about military and castles and walls, when there was a gap there, it was a dangerous place. It's not a place that you wanted to exist. And they had to repair the gap. And in Ezekiel, God is searching for someone to stand in the gap. And no one could be found. Week 1, we said God is still looking today for people to stand in the gap, to stand in the place that is dangerous, that is broken, that is hurting, that is in a place that it is not where it's supposed to be. God is looking for people. Last week we saw the life of Nehemiah. And a couple things that we got out of Nehemiah's life as he rebuilt the wall in Jerusalem was when we are aware of a gap, we have a responsibility. When we are aware that there's a gap, now we got a responsibility. We can't claim ignorance no more. Ignorance is not a valid excuse. And we also learned that when we stand in the gap, you got to expect drama, difficulties. Sanballat, Geshem, Tobiah, 3 dudes throughout the book of Nehemiah that continually caused trouble for Nehemiah. And if you want to catch up on that, you can check out our YouTube channel, and last week's message is on there if you are interested. But tonight we get into Esther, and Esther chapter 4, verse 16 will kind of be the hinge pin for tonight. It reads as following. Go gather all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go see the king. If I must die, I must die. Check out this next video.
Esther was a young Jewish woman. She was born into a broken family. She was a minority in an oppressive society. The odds were against her right from the start. But almost overnight, Esther went from rags to riches, from poverty to the palace. And she became the wife of King Xerxes I, making her one of the most powerful women in history. Irony seems to fill the pages of the book of Esther. Just as Persia has unknowingly crowned a Jewish queen, the king's vizier, a man named Haman, is plotting a diabolical scheme to exterminate the Jewish race through a bloody massacre. There is only one Jew in the land who is in a position to intervene on behalf of her people. It's Esther. But it seems as though the pleasures of the palace had begun to intoxicate her. She begins to struggle with what course of action to take. As Esther looked around at the beautiful palace that was now her home, with its luxuries, pleasures, conveniences, and the wealth she had come to enjoy, it must have been difficult for her to imagine throwing it all away in some misguided attempt at heroism. She knew that taking this matter to the king would force her to risk everything she had, including her very life. Perhaps a more subtle approach would be best. Maybe she should just lie low for a while and wait to see how things would play out. Perhaps at some point she would have an opportunity to put in a good word for the Jews without jeopardizing herself. After all, what good would she be to anyone if she were dead? But Mordecai, Esther's cousin, sensing her internal struggle, sent her this message: do not flatter yourself that you shall escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from elsewhere. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows but that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this.
So it is. We've got, in the book of Esther, there's many characters, of course, but two main ones from the Jewish side exist. Is Esther and her cousin. I'll call him Cuzzo for our purposes tonight. Cuzzo Mordecai. So here we got this picture, and if you got to understand that in biblical times, the names that people were called were more than simply a nice name. Names had deep meaning. It guided your future, or so they believed. It wasn't simply Esther sounds good, or Jim sounds good, or Bill sounds good, or Joanna sounds good. It held meaning, and so it is with Queen Esther. See, her name, Esther, was a Persian name, which meant star, but her Jewish name, nothing fancy was there. It meant myrtle plant. Those of you who have ever engaged the plants myrtle, they're a simple plant that grows on the ground and spreads out all over the place. They just keep multiplying. They end up covering wherever they grow. So there's nothing really special about the name myrtle plant. My grandmother was named that. I thought she was very special, but the plant is not very special. Mordecai, his Persian name, came from a pagan god. So what? What's this mean for us? Well, just on the names alone, no one in that setting would have ever thought anything significant would come out of those two people. In essence, what it means for us is that God can use anyone. God can and will use anyone. Now, when you get into the book of Esther, there are some problems, if you will, with the story, right? Problems. One, God's name is not mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. Nowhere is the name of God mentioned in the book of Esther. It's a book in the Bible. You would think God's name is mentioned, but nowhere is God's name mentioned in the book of Esther. I would dare say, though, God's presence is everywhere through the book of Esther. Let's get back to the problems. Esther and Mordecai didn't return home with their Jewish people when it was time to go back home. They were exiled in this place. And when it was time to go back home, most of the people went back home. But Esther and Mordecai got comfortable back there in Susa. They just decided to stay there. In fact, Esther didn't even reveal that she was a Jew until much, much, much later. Esther wasn't perfect. You see, Esther had her secret identity. She was fronting. I don't know if you know anybody that fronts, but when someone's fronting, you're just like, I don't know if I can trust them. I don't want to be around them. I don't know if they can do anything significant because they're not who they say they are. Mordecai told her to keep it on the DL, and the background of their faith was the Jewish people in the worship of Almighty God, and yet now they're in a pagan society and taking on every part of their culture, and they're comfortable. Esther ends up marrying the king in some really crazy story that you can read for yourself of how that ever came about, and she ends up in a harem where the king gets to look at her physically and say, do I want her or do I want all these other women? Not a Christian story. Not the way to go about dating and trying to find someone to marry. Not to join a harem. And if you're engaged in that, I suggest you get out. You see, there's significance here, too. The significance is that God is not looking for perfect people. God is looking for the available. God is not looking for perfect people. So many times I've heard people say, well, I just don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. I don't know how. I don't know nothing about God. I don't know nothing about the Bible. I don't know anything about that kind of stuff. Good. No one's perfect. And God's not looking for perfect people. In fact, God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. Please erase that, or start to erase it from your vocabulary. I'm not enough for God. No, God uses the available. Anyone who thinks they're perfect or thinks they're good enough has another story coming, and they get humbled pretty quickly. Interesting, though, God still moved in the book of Esther, even though his name isn't mentioned, without titles, without names, without religious boxes. Could he possibly still do the same today? I offer to you that he can. We don't necessarily need a title, a name, an adjective in front of whatever we do to make it as if God can move in and through and use it. God can. He will. But that's another message for another time. See, Esther's setting is this. Esther's contemporary culture was driven by money, by sex, by power, by pleasures, and by possessions. Sound familiar? Our contemporary culture. Turn on the top 40. Turn on the top 10 on WGCI or Power 92. Money, sex, power, possessions. And not even hiding it at all. Our setting, God is mocked. Hallelujah, which is the highest praise, is treated as someone's response to sexual pleasure. And morals are viewed as outdated or archaic. Church is seen as stupid or optional at best. You see, even in the church, we take on the temperature of the culture all too often. And I'm not talking about styles, and I'm not talking about sonic things. I'm not talking about those things. I'm talking about the things of sin. And we take that on, and we become comfortable. You see, we need to learn from Esther and her cousin, Mordecai. See, we can learn from them how to stand in the gap in critical moments, because one was coming for Esther and Mordecai. You see, the wise people learn from those who went before. The other day, I was out trying to chainsaw off a huge limb in my backyard. And I thought I could do it. I went online, I got the tutorial of how to cut down a tree, I had all that together, but I just didn't have the experiential wisdom. And I ended up getting my chainsaw caught in the tree up 10, 15 feet up in the air, wondering how am I going to get it down, pulling on this rope with Joanna and the kids, pulling on the rope, trying to get the tree to open up enough that I can get the chainsaw out. That didn't work. Put an axe in there, banging on it with a hammer. That didn't work. Took my SUV, tied a chain on it onto the rope, tried to pull it, and four-wheel drive low. The rope busted. That didn't work. I had to go get another chainsaw. Wisdom you learn from those who went before. Amen. Romans 15:4. Such things were written in the scriptures long ago to teach us. Amen. And the scriptures give us hope and encouragement as we wait patiently for God's promises to be fulfilled. See, pause and think about that. When I was in college, one of the greatest points of wisdom when I was ultra ambitious, dealing with racism on campus and issues of multiculturalism and all that sort of stuff, was very, I would say, quasi-militant. I was pretty vocal. And me and my best friend at the time sat down with the vice president, and vice president said, you know what, Ryan? What your ambition, your zealousness is what us older people need. But you need our wisdom. So wherever stage you are in life chronologically, you haven't graduated. You've got something to offer. It's a Friday. Before we move on, this is important. Friday I was talking with a bunch of pastors, mostly pastors, and there's a pastor in his 70s is getting ready to retire after, I think he said 40 years of ministry, or maybe more. And he was talking, and I said, Pastor Norm, what you have to offer, even if you retire officially from ministry, is valuable. You never retire. You've got something to offer. Those of us who are younger, maybe we don't view that in the lens, but when you start to get older, you begin to see that you can't do the same things that what you once were able to do physically, or the energy levels just change and it adjusts. That's just part of natural life. But please remember, file in your hard drive of your mind, or in your Rolodex if you're from that era. Do not graduate. You have something valuable to give. And part of our struggle in our community, part of the gap that exists, is a gap between the generations where young bucks just don't know any better and are trying to reinvent the wheel all the time. And old smart guys are too comfortable on the couch to reach out to the young bucks. Let's move on. The threat came to Esther and the situation in Esther chapter 3. Mordecai is at a position, and this dude by the name of Haman, who was high-ranking official in the country, learned about Mordecai's Jewish nationality. So he decided that it bothered him. It really irritated him, and it wasn't enough for him just to eradicate Mordecai. He wanted to get everybody, everyone who was a Jew, which included Esther. He looked for a way to destroy all the Jews in the empire. So he offered the king to pay him 2/3 of the empire's annual income for a grand party when all the Jews were killed. In order to get that money, he would go plunder the people he just killed. Take their possessions, if they had any gold, melt it down, sell it off, go pay off the king. The king agreed. Now understand, Esther is a Jew. If this truth was made known, she would lose her life too. Now see, Mordecai's ear was to the streets. And he heard what was about to go down. A question I got to ask you is your ear to the streets? I'm not necessarily talking about streets as in hood streets, although it could include that. But are your ears attuned to issues, gaps in the wall, things that are not as they should be? You see, what did Cuzzo do? Mordecai, when he heard this, he ripped his clothes and began to mourn. And he put on sackcloth and ashes, which was a representation of being in great mourning and just in absolute anguish. And what did Esther do? Esther's in a place of comfort. Cuzzo's outside. He looks like a mess. You shouldn't be doing that, Cuzzo. You're bringing too much attention to yourself. Let me just give you some nice new clothes. You can cover it all up. And you can act like nothing's really wrong. You don't have to snitch. Esther chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, when Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. Have you ever heard someone say, or maybe it's your own voice, well, it's really not that big of a deal. Or maybe it's, let's not make a big deal of it. If we just make it quiet, if you just go along with the flow, Everything will be okay. This is what's going on here. Put on some new clothes and clean yourself up. It's really not that bad, Kelzo, says Esther in her place of comfort. Here's a question. Do I numb my senses to the horror of sin? Do I numb my senses to the horror of sin? Sin is horrible, devastating, death-inducing, separating you from God, nasty, hurtful, evil, everything that you don't want to pay attention to. And sometimes we numb our senses by possessions, pleasures, and distractions, not to feel the reality of sin. Do we put on the clothes that Esther was offering her cousin? Mordecai didn't. Mordecai's like, why? I'm about to be killed. So are you. And you want me to change my clothes? For real? This thing is horrible. And you want to, like, go shopping? You want to go to TJ Maxx or the Village? Well, the Village used to be a place to go. Lord. Go out to Michigan City to the outlets? And Mordecai, in chapter 4, begins to ask Esther some tough questions. Verse 11, he's going through and all the kings and officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die. See, her cousin is asking Esther to speak to the king. And Esther's like, don't you know what's going to happen? I haven't seen my husband in a long time. And the rule of the land was that if you come into your husband's lair, into his room, without being summoned by your husband, you will die. She knew the story of his previous wife, who actually kind of stood up for some elements of morality, but she got kicked to the curb. So that story is well published in the land. She knew what was about to happen. She was a queen. She was an undercover Jew. She was comfortable and rich, and she could be instantly killed by the king for simply speaking to her. Verse 13 of chapter 4, Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment because you're in the palace you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at this time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. It's a crossroads moment. It's a point of decision. For such a time as this, maybe you're in a similar position as Esther. Maybe it's not life or death, or maybe it quite possibly could be, but you're at a point of decision, and it's for such a time as this. God is asking, God is stirring within you. There is something, there's a gap. There is some danger. There are some things that just aren't right. Maybe it's in your own household. Maybe it's in relationships that you are in. Maybe it is in your family, husband, wife. Maybe it's with the kids. Maybe it's in your school. Maybe it's in your place of work. Maybe it's in your community. Maybe there is something that God is putting in your heart and stirring you that you begin to see that this is not right. And it's God illuminating a gap that exists. And he wants you to stand in the gap for such a time as this. And maybe you exist in that job, in that family, in that relationship, in that community for such a time as this.
Amen. That's right. Amen. That's right. Amen.
This was her purpose. She didn't have to go search out some other purpose or meaning in life. This was her purpose. Yes. She was now beginning to be broken by that need and compared it to the price of her life. and was willing to die if necessary. There was no miraculous sign. There was no writing on the wall. There was no voice from heaven. She prayed, prepared, and acted in courage. Here's some tough questions. Can God ask me to risk it all? Esther's cousin asked Esther to risk it all. He knew the stakes. Can God ask me to risk it all? Second question, kind of similar but vastly different. Will I give God permission to ask me the question to risk it all? The first question is simply on God. Can he ask us to risk everything for what he is asking us to do? Can he do it? Yes. See it in Esther. You see throughout countless people throughout scriptures, throughout history, Jesus Christ, his own son. And not because he's mean, angry, but out of love. Because he knows that a gap needs to be breached. And God has made us for such a time as this. But the other thing comes to an act of our will. Will I give God permission to ask me to do it? Because God can be able to do it, but he's not going to sit there and force our will when we say, God, F you, I ain't doing it. Because I bet, I'll go as far as knowing that all of us, in one form or the other, said, F you, God, I ain't doing it. I'm not giving that up. I'm not going there. I'm not talking to that person. They got beef with me. If they got beef with me, they got to bring it to me. I'm not going to them. I'm just going to hide in my crib, bump everything else that's going on in the community. F you, God. That's graphic, but that's what it is. Will I give God permission? Saying, God, my arms are open wide. Whatever it is, I'm willing. That is the sacrifice of praise to the Lord. That is beautiful in his sight. There's a guy in the 1930s who was a preacher in Germany during the time of Hitler and Nazi Germany. And at that time, most leaders and pastors in that community, in that nation, believed that Hitler was a positive revolutionary. They thought he was going to change the nation for better. But this pastor by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer viewed something much differently. And God began to touch his heart to stand in the gap. I want you to take a look at this video.
We don't know a ton about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's last hours, but what we know is he was a faithful Christian to the end. In the 1930s, he wrote his famous book, The Cost of Discipleship, but he's probably most famous for his decision to get involved in the plot against Adolf Hitler. And it was not an easy decision for him. The Nazis were getting more and more powerful, and so many people were bamboozled by the complexity of the situation. It's very easy for us with hindsight to say, oh, I would have done this, or the church should have done this, but it was very complex, very difficult. Bonhoeffer was a man who simply wanted to do the will of God. He was the leader of an illegal seminary, an underground seminary of the confessing church. Those are the good guys who did not go along with the Nazified state church. He was not seeking to die. I think he would not make his decisions based on fear. He simply wanted to know, what would the Lord call me to do? And things were changing in Germany very dramatically, and Bonhoeffer was constantly asking the Lord to show him, now what do I do? Now what do I do? This was a time where really when the SS gave orders to destroy synagogues, to burn synagogues. This was in 1938. He realized that this attack on the Jews was an attack directly on God himself and on the people of God. And innocent lives are being killed left and right, more and more and more and more and more. When do we say, I have to stop him with violence? I mean, you realize that Bonhoeffer was always thinking these things through logically, but Bonhoeffer also knew that the God of the Scripture is the God of the Scripture. And if he calls me to do something, who am I to even question it? There's a joy in obeying this God. If you're worshiping God, you know that he's exhorting you to act. He's exhorting you to take chances as long as you're doing it unto him, as long as you're trying to obey him. Even if you make mistakes, it's okay. And Bonhoeffer saw lots of people in the church who were afraid. They were acting defensively, acting fearfully, and saying, well, I better not do this, better not do that. Bonhoeffer said, well, better to do something unto the Lord than just hide and just wait for this period to pass. And when the time came actually to get involved in the plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, he did come to the conclusion that this was what God was calling him to do, and he took action. He was very bold, and he was all about action. And just around this time, he was arrested for his involvement in an operation to get 7 Jews out of Germany. That's a far cry from being involved in the plot to kill Hitler. Then once that plot was uncovered, of course, Bonhoeffer's days were numbered. Bonhoeffer always understood that there's a price you pay, that there's a risk. The difference between action and inaction simply has to do with faith. If you have robust faith in Jesus Christ, you're a different person than somebody who is merely religious. From the moment he really got serious about his faith, Bonhoeffer understood that to give my life to Christ is immediately to give it up, to give it away. So whether he takes it from me literally, whether I die, I'm already supposed to be dead to myself. That's the whole point of it. And so it gives you a strange freedom. You're free. In fact, we know that only about 18 hours before his death, he conducted a service. And this is just before the Gestapo knocks on the door, and they drove him a number of hours to Flossenburg. And at dawn on the morning of April 9th, 1945, he was hanged. Bonhoeffer had this really extraordinary, and I would say supernatural ability to hear what God was saying, to get the biblical perspective, and he was astoundingly resolute. And then he was a champion, a hero in being resolute, and not just for himself, but in how he dealt with other people, exhorting them to act, not just to say, well, this is interesting, let's have some more committee meetings, but to think it through to the bottom and then to act.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote in a book following 2 sentences that you grab me. It says, there is not a place to which the Christian can withdraw from the world, whether it be outwardly or in the sphere of inner life. Any attempt to escape from the world must sooner or later be paid for with a sinful surrender to the world. Esther was not perfect, far from it. Made some questionable at best decisions in her life. Sinned. Was double-minded. Wanted to be in the king's lair, if you will, and enjoy everything of the culture and everything that was going on. And yet she had a history of a family and a bloodline that followed the Almighty God. She was back and forth. She wasn't perfect, and yet God made her for such a time as that. And is a great remixer of everything that is not right to accomplish his purposes. Romans 8:28. You see, those who are most courageous to act aren't ones who are without fear or without questions about what might happen. They are not always totally comfortable about what it is that God is calling them to do, what God is stirring within them to do, what He's putting in their heart to engage with people or situations. They're not always totally comfortable. And in fact, I would say that that is a gift, because it causes us to lean on the Lord that much more, because we are so weak in and of ourselves. Things are always not nice and neat. In fact, the gap is dangerous. That broken relationship where someone said something about you and you got all mad and you never talked to them again to try to reconcile that thing, it's dangerous. They could just simply write you off. Situations in your community, situations in your home, situations in your school, situations on the job. It could be dangerous. You may not get promoted, possibly. You might get fired, hopefully not. People may look at you strange. The homies on the block may threaten your life. What good is life when we're not living it for the King of Kings?
Amen.
See, there's not a place where which Christians can withdraw from the world, whether it be outwardly or from the sphere of our inward life. Any attempt to escape the world must be sooner or later paid for with a sinful surrender to that world. And I'm seeing too often in families and in relationships and communities in school, people who have surrendered and just got comfortable, and they're not stirred in their heart that this is not right and it needs to stop. Last night I was DJing a party for a Sweet 16 and thing, and there was a police officer there, and he was just sharing his struggles on the streets and the situations that are going on in our community. And as he was sharing it, it hit me, something that I've heard over and over and over again in newspapers from individuals, that the numbers of people who are creating the problem are severely, severely minimal in comparison, by and large, to the law-abiding citizens. And yet we acquiesce to all that nonsense, and innocent people get caught. Do you see the hurt? Do you see the trouble? Do you see that you are not an accident today, right now, on the 26th, 2015? You are not an accident. You did not exist accidentally for this. You were made for such a time as this, to stand in the gap.
Amen.
Remember, your actions have far-reaching impact, often beyond what you can see. What if Haman would have succeeded in exterminating all the Jews? There would be no Jewish people. There would be no Christ. There would be no church. There would be no salvation. So there's two questions that we must wrestle with, and they beg a response. Number one, will I respond with wisdom and courage and stand in the gap that's before me? Do I respond with wisdom and courage, or will I make excuses and simply walk away? It's not my problem. It's not my family. Too bad for them. I don't know them. Don't get involved. Homies say don't snitch. They're not my color. They're not my age. They're not my income bracket. They're older than me. They're younger than me. I'm not getting involved. Will I respond with wisdom and courage, or will I make excuses and walk away? Tonight we're going to close a little bit differently, maybe. And I'm going to ask you simply, if you tonight, God's been touching your heart, and maybe it's been beyond just tonight, but it's been a process, and you're in a position, and you're saying, you know what, Pastor, God's just working in me. He's stirring something in me. And you're saying, tonight there's something that I need to stand in the gap for. Maybe it's a person, maybe it's a group of people, maybe it's something in your community, maybe it's something that other people see as insignificant, but within you and your situation, it is massive. And you're saying, tonight, I'm going to stand in the gap. And what I'm going to ask you to do is actually stand, and I want to pray. Part of our struggle sometimes is we want to do everything in the closet and nobody else sees. But when it comes to standing in the gap, there's nothing private about it. Amen. So I ask you just now, if you are saying, you know what? Unto God, not unto me, but unto God. God, I'm here. I'm going to stand in the gap. I'm asking you for wisdom. I'm asking you for courage, God. I want to stand in the gap. Just stand to your feet and then we'll pray. Father, you see these standing before you. Not standing before me, but standing before you and saying, Lord, we need you. We need your courage. We need your wisdom as you have touched our hearts to stand in the gap, to stand in a place of vulnerability, to stand in a place of danger, to stand in a place of brokenness.